If you've been on my channel for a while, you already know I'm a huge fan of the Total War series. And with Creative Assembly releasing a new DLC focused on Rome's unification of Italy, I figured this was the perfect moment to explore how that process truly unfolded in real history. Not just a list of battles or a neat timeline, but the actual mechanisms that allowed Rome to gather so many different peoples, cultures, and identities under its banner. Because the Rome we usually imagine, a single, unified, perfectly organized state, was nothing like early Rome at all. In the beginning, it was messy, fragmented, and incredibly diverse. To understand Rome's rise, we need to start with Italy itself. The Italian peninsula is one of the most varied landscapes in the ancient world. Massive mountain ranges dominate the region, the Alps in the north, towering and snow-covered, and the Apennines running like a rugged spine down the peninsula. Add volcanic peaks like Etna into the mix, and you get a terrain that is dramatic, unpredictable, and difficult to unify. Nearly 40% of Italy is mountainous, which means countless rivers cut down from the highlands, lakes form in the valleys, and communities end up isolated in pockets where they develop their own customs, dialects, and ways of life. At the same time, Italy has an enormous amount of coastline on the mainland, and the surrounding islands giving many communities easy access to the Mediterranean. In the ancient world, that meant trade travel, outside influence, and contact with cultures from Greece, Africa, and beyond. So from the very start, Italy produced a mosaic of societies shaped by the land they lived on. Farmers on the fertile plains, shepherds and herders in the rugged highlands, traders and sailors along the coasts and valley communities that developed almost like miniature worlds of their own. Even before Rome existed, Italy was a patchwork of distinct peoples: Latins in the west, Etruscans in the north, Sabines in the hills, Samnites in the mountains, Greek colonies in the south, and countless smaller tribes in between. There was no Italy as we think of it today, just a wide, complex, ever-changing collection of cultures. And into this vibrant but chaotic environment, the earliest version of Rome was born. In its earliest form, Rome wasn't a city, it wasn't even a big village. It was a set of small settlements on the hills overlooking the Tiber River. Archaeology shows simple huts, wooden fences, and clusters of families living on separate hilltops, like the Palatine, the Aventine, the Caelian, and others. These hilltop villages likely competed, cooperated, traded, and occasionally fought. But over time, something important happened. They began to merge. This merging wasn't sudden, it was gradual and very human. Paths between hills became more defined. A shared market space appeared. Religious festivals started involving people from multiple hills. Cemeteries became communal. And eventually, leadership structures and governing bodies began representing not just a single hill community, but several. The Greeks had a term for this process, synoecism, which simply means coming together into one home. And Rome wasn't unique in this. Many Latin communities were going through the same evolution. But Rome happened to do it earlier, more effectively, and with a stronger gravitational pull. By the 6th and 7th centuries, BC, conflict between Latin communities was still common. These weren't huge battles, more like clan raids, skirmishes, and disputes over land or resources. But Rome gradually started winning more of these small-scale conflicts. The first town said to fall to Rome was Canina, only a few kilometers away. Legend says Romulus killed their king in battle and paraded home with the first Roman triumph. Whether or not that story is literal, the pattern it represents is accurate. Rome fought a neighbor, seized some of its territory, brought in colonists, merged populations, and slowly expanded its control. Another nearby community, Antemnae, followed the same path. Conquered, absorbed, blended into the Roman population. Many of these Latin-speaking communities eventually received Roman citizenship, an early version of a strategy Rome would rely on for centuries. Conquer, integrate, expand, repeat. By the time Rome transitioned from monarchy to republic in 509 BC, it had already brought half of the 30 Latin towns under its control, ruled over roughly 800 square kilometers, and had a population close to 35. By ancient standards, that was impressive. But none of this growth happened quickly. Rome didn't explode across Italy overnight. It advanced slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, building momentum over centuries while constantly facing setbacks, rebellions, defeats, and challenges from more powerful neighbors. Because Rome wasn't surrounded by weaklings. To the north, the Etruscans had wealthy, advanced cities. To the east and southeast, tough hill tribes like the Equians and Volscians raided and fought constantly. To To the northeast, the Sabines were a major presence, and farther south, rich Greek colonies dominated the coastline. Still, Rome had a strategic advantage the Latin League. This was an alliance of Latin towns originally led by Alba Longa, but as Rome grew stronger, it slowly became the dominant member. That didn't sit well with the other cities, and in the 490s BC, the Latin towns united to push back against Rome's rising power. The conflict came to a head at the Battle of Lake Regillus, a fight so dramatic that later Romans claimed the twin gods Castor and Pollux appeared to help them win. Whether myth or propaganda, the result was clear: Rome defeated the League and forced a treaty that changed everything. Under the treaty, Rome and the Latin cities agreed to mutual defense, shared spoils of war, and joint colonies in newly conquered lands. The Latins received shared rights, something that made them partners rather than subjugated subjects. This arrangement became one of Rome's most important tools for expansion. Instead of destroying conquered communities, Rome often turned them into allies bound by law, tradition, and shared benefits. With this structure supporting them, Rome spent the next century pushing outward. They advanced south and east, established new Roman and Latin colonies, and slowly secured their immediate surroundings. But the north remained a challenge thanks to Veii, a powerful Etruscan city only 16 kilometers away. Rome and Veii fought repeatedly for control of land and trade, especially the valuable salt routes. Eventually, after a grinding 10-year siege, Rome finally took Veii in 396 BC. It was a massive moment, one of their first truly major victories. They gained land wealth and prestige, and they sent Roman colonists to settle the newly conquered territory. But right when Rome seemed to be rising, disaster struck. In 390 BC, around 30,000 Celtic warriors from the north, led by a chieftain named Brennus, poured into central Italy. Rome tried to stop them at the River Allia and failed catastrophically. The Celtic army smashed Roman forces and marched straight into the city itself. Most Romans fled. A handful held out on the Capitoline Hill, but everything else burned. The Celts occupied the city for months, and the trauma of that event stayed with Rome for centuries. And yet Rome did something remarkable. It rebuilt, fast. A lot of this was thanks to its recent victory over Veii, which had given Rome fresh land resources and manpower. Refugees returned. New citizens were added. The city began to grow again. Within a generation, Rome not only recovered, but came back stronger than before. That resilience would become one of Rome's defining traits, an ability to take a disaster, absorb the blow, and come back with even more determination. Rome's comeback after the Gallic sack wasn't just impressive, it was the turning point that propelled the city toward dominating the entire Italian peninsula. Once the immediate crisis passed, Rome wasted no time reasserting its influence. The destruction of the city had shaken the Latin League and emboldened other groups to challenge Roman authority. But Rome responded with its usual mix of stubbornness, reform, and expansion. The city rebuilt its walls, reorganized parts of its army, and leaned heavily on the newly acquired lands from Veii to restock its population and manpower. As Rome regained its strength, it pushed southward into Campania, a region famed for its fertile soil, wealthy cities, and strategic value. But expanding into Campania brought Rome into conflict with another powerful force, the Samnites. These were tough, mountainous tribes living in the Apennines, renowned for their warrior culture, discipline, and ability to fight effectively in difficult terrain. The Samnites were nothing like the small Latin towns Rome had absorbed in earlier centuries. They were a major Italian power in their own right. The struggle between Rome and the Samnites would define an entire era and unfold in 3 massive wars across nearly 50 years. These weren't quick raids or border disputes, they were prolonged, brutal struggles involving shifting alliances, military reforms, and battles that tested Rome in ways it had never experienced before. The First Samnite War began because of the rich city of Capua. Caught between threats from the Samnites and internal instability, Capua appealed to Rome for support. For the first time, Rome intervened far beyond Latium, entering a conflict where they didn't share language or culture with the people they were trying to protect. This was a bold step, almost a preview of how Rome would later involve itself across the Mediterranean. The war ended without a decisive shift in territory, but it helped Rome establish a foothold in Campania and build relationships that would later prove incredibly valuable. The Second Samnite War was far more dramatic. It began when Rome founded a colony at Fregellae, in territory the Samnites considered their own. This was the spark that ignited a conflict lasting more than 2 decades. The Samnites were masters of hill warfare, using the rough terrain to their advantage in ways Rome wasn't ready for. The most infamous moment came at the Battle of the Caudine Forks, when Roman forces marched into a mountain pass, only to find themselves trapped by Samnite forces on both sides. The Romans were forced to surrender without being able to fight, and in an act meant to humiliate them. The Roman soldiers were made to pass under a yoke of spears, something the Romans never forgot and never forgave. But Rome did what it always did. It learned, adapted, and came back stronger. They reorganized their armies, built new roads to move troops more effectively through rough terrain, and established colonies to secure key points around Samnite territory. The war turned into a grinding contest of willpower, and over time, Rome's massive pool of manpower, reinforced by their network of allies, gave them an advantage that the Samnites simply couldn't match. By the end of the war, Rome emerged stronger, more organized, and with more allies than before. The Third Samnite War was the last attempt by the Samnites and their allies, including Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls, to stop Rome's southward expansion. It was a final, desperate coalition. But Rome's military machine was now far more sophisticated than it had been decades earlier. The Romans systematically defeated each opposing group, capturing territory and breaking alliances one by one. By the end of the conflict, Rome had secured dominance over central Italy. This period of warfare reshaped Rome completely. The city was no longer just a regional power, it was now the leading force in the peninsula. Military reforms, new roads, colonies, and alliances strengthened Rome's grip on its territories. And with each victory, Rome gained what would become its greatest strategic asset: manpower. Through a mix of citizenship grants, Latin rights alliances, and colonization, Rome built a network of communities that were obligated and often honored to supply soldiers. No matter how many losses Rome suffered, no matter how many times an army was wiped out, Rome always seemed able to raise another. As Rome moved south after defeating the Samnites, the Greeks of southern Italy became the next major challenge. Greek colonies like Tarentum were wealthy, cultured, and deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean world. But they were also divided and often called in foreign powers for help when threatened. When Rome began extending its influence into regions the Greeks considered their sphere, tensions rose. Tarentum made a fateful decision. They invited King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a highly respected Hellenistic general and a relative of Alexander the Great, to come to Italy and defend Greek interests. Pyrrhus arrived with war elephants, elite infantry, and a professional army trained in the Macedonian style. Rome had never fought anyone like him before. Their battles were fierce and close, with Pyrrhus winning several early victories that came at such high cost they gave rise to the famous term Pyrrhic victory. But while Pyrrhus could win battles, he couldn't break Rome's system. Rome's capacity to replace lost troops seemed endless. Even after losing entire armies, Rome always returned to the field determined to keep fighting. Pyrrhus, unlike Rome, relied on mercenaries and long-distance support. His victories began to drain his resources. Eventually, he left Italy, and with his departure, the Greek cities fell under Roman influence one by one. Rome now controlled nearly the entire Italian peninsula. But conquering territory was only one piece of the puzzle. What made Rome so effective was that it didn't need to destroy every community it defeated. Instead, Rome used a remarkably flexible system of integration that allowed different populations to become part of the Roman sphere while retaining varying degrees of autonomy. The first method Rome used was direct conquest, followed by incorporation. When Rome annexed a territory, especially ones culturally close to Latium, the inhabitants were often granted Roman citizenship. Not everyone received the same privileges. Some communities gained full citizenship with voting rights, while others were given citizenship without the right to vote. But either way, they became part of the Roman state and were expected to serve in the military. The second method was colonization. Rome and the Latin League frequently founded colonies in newly conquered regions, placing Roman or Latin settlers in strategic locations. These colonies acted as defensive outposts, cultural anchors, and military supply centers. Colonists didn't always have full citizenship, but they had Latin rights and a clear stake in Rome's success. They formed a buffer system that projected Roman influence far beyond Latium. The third and arguably most important method was alliance. Rome would defeat a community, then allow it to remain largely self-governing in exchange for supporting Rome's military efforts. These allies didn't serve in the legions. Instead, they contributed troops that fought alongside Roman forces as socii, or allied contingents. This alliance network became the backbone of Rome's military might. As long as the alliances held, Rome had access to a nearly unmatched pool of soldiers from across Italy. This system also meant Rome didn't need to micromanage every corner of its territories. Local elites kept their power. Local customs and laws remained mostly intact. But Rome controlled foreign policy war decisions and military contributions. It was a subtle but powerful model one that gave Rome enormous influence without the administrative burden of ruling every captured region directly. If you imagine Rome as a boxer, this alliance network was like a heavyweight fighter with an endless reserve of stamina. Rome could take blows that would have knocked out other states. Defeat wasn't final, it was temporary. As long as the alliance system remained intact, Rome could always recover. This is exactly why Hannibal, centuries later, didn't just attack Rome, he attacked its alliances. After winning at Cannae, he focused on trying to break up Rome's network, hoping cities and tribes would defect. And while some did, most stayed loyal enough that Rome survived even its darkest moments. But the vulnerability in Rome's system also became clear later during the Social War. When Rome's allies, who had contributed soldiers for generations, rose up demanding the full citizenship they felt they'd earned. Even then, Rome ultimately prevailed, absorbing the allies into full citizenship and transforming the political landscape yet again. By the time Rome unified Italy, it had done so not just through battles, but through relationships, incentives, and a shockingly effective balance of integration and autonomy. And with Italy unified under its influence, Rome now had the manpower, resources, and strategic depth to look outward toward Carthage, Greece, and eventually the entire Mediterranean. By the time Rome completed its domination of Italy, the city had transformed from a cluster of hilltop villages into the most powerful state in the peninsula. But what's truly fascinating is that Rome didn't rely on a single method to achieve this. It used a flexible, layered system, sometimes harsh, sometimes surprisingly cooperative, that allowed vastly different communities to be tied into a larger whole. This wasn't empire building by simply planting flags on a map. It was a slow weaving together of cultures, loyalties, obligations, and opportunities. And because Rome's methods were so adaptable, they created a foundation strong enough to survive disasters that would have destroyed other states. When an army was annihilated, Rome raised another. When a city rebelled, Rome punished it, yet still found ways to reincorporate it. When enemies tried to isolate Rome, the city found new allies. It was this ability to take hits, absorb shocks, and return even stronger that made Rome something radically different from other ancient powers. Looking back across Italy during the final phase of its unification, it's clear that Rome was not simply sweeping across a passive landscape. Every region had its own identity, its own local politics, its own concerns. Etruscan cities had ancient traditions of kingship and divination. The Samnites were rugged mountain warriors defined by clan loyalties. Greek colonies prized autonomy and cultural prestige. Oscan-speaking tribes followed their own local customs and federations. Yet Rome found pathways, sometimes through force, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through strategic generosity, that allowed all of these groups to fall into its orbit. The strength of Rome's approach becomes even clearer when compared to its enemies. Take the Samnites, they fought fiercely, but they didn't have a unified strategy for integrating conquered peoples. Or the Greek colonies, wealthy, intelligent, culturally advanced, yet politically fragmented and constantly calling outside powers for help. The Celts were terrifying in battle, but had little long-term cohesion. Even Pyrrhus, brilliant as he was, arrived with a single professional army that could win battles but couldn't win a war when facing Rome's bottomless manpower reserves. Rome's real superweapon wasn't the legion, at least not alone. It was the system behind the legion. When Rome absorbed a new community, it wasn't just taking land, it was gaining soldiers. And because so many of these communities retained some form of self-governance or rights, they had incentives to work with Rome rather than constantly rebel. Local elites got to keep their power. Cities kept their dignity. In some cases, they even gained new trade opportunities, new legal protections, or the prestige of being associated with Rome. Over time, what looked like a scattered checkerboard of alliances, colonies, autonomous towns, and partial citizen communities gradually began operating like a single organism. Not uniform, not homogeneous, but interconnected, coordinated, and able to act with remarkable unity when the moment demanded it. And when foreign powers looked at Italy, they didn't see a bunch of disjointed tribes anymore, they saw Rome. Still, it's important to realize that Roman expansion wasn't some unstoppable, perfectly executed master plan. It involved countless setbacks, internal tensions, political rivalries, and moments when everything seemed on the edge of collapse. The Gallic sacked the humiliations against the Samnites. Early defeats in the wars with Pyrrhus, all of these could easily have broken a less resilient society, but each crisis pushed Rome to adapt, innovate, and rethink its strategies. One of the most underestimated factors in Rome's success was its ability to share pieces of its identity. For example, the expansion of Roman religion temples, priests, festivals, cults played a surprisingly important role. When a city was brought into Rome's orbit, Roman gods often appeared in their temples. Roman holidays began to mix with local ones. Rituals that had once been specific to Latium became familiar across the peninsula. Even the way Rome distributed land after conquests helped shape a shared economic and social structure. Colonists lived among locals. Veterans were settled on new plots. Over time, a kind of cultural blending took place, slowly smoothing out the divisions that once defined Italy. Rome also mastered the art of infrastructure. The construction of roads straight, durable, and strategically placed connected Italian communities in a way they had never been connected before. These roads weren't just for armies. They facilitated trade communication and movement of people. Merchants from inland towns could reach the coast more easily. Farmers could sell surplus grain farther away. For the first time, Italy functioned as a network rather than a series of isolated pockets. And then there was the Roman approach to law. Even before the famous 12 Tables, Romans valued written rules, predictable procedures, and legal integration. When allies or semi-citizen communities interacted with Rome, they often gained access to a form of Latin rights or legal protections that made Rome seem less like a conqueror and more like a guarantor of stability. Local elites began sending their sons to Rome, interacting with Roman officials and adopting Roman dress and customs. The more they engaged with Rome, the more they became part of its world. By the time the unification of Italy was essentially complete, you could argue that Rome had done something revolutionary. It turned a peninsula full of rival cultures into a cooperative alliance system that could mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers with remarkable speed and consistency. It wasn't perfect. Resentment simmered for generations, eventually erupting in the social war. But even that conflict ended with the Allies becoming citizens, further strengthening the unity of Italy. This entire system laid the groundwork for Rome's next great leaps. With Italy secure, Rome could project its power outward. Carthage, Macedonia, the Seleucids, and dozens of other states would eventually face the same relentless machine that had conquered Italy. But the reason Rome could challenge and eventually defeat so many powerful adversaries was because of the system it built at home, one that produced a scale of manpower, loyalty, resources, and resilience that no other Mediterranean power could match. Even centuries later, historians still debate whether Rome's success came from its strategies, its adaptability, its geography, its legions, or some deep cultural characteristic that pushed Romans to keep going when others would have surrendered. But when you look closely at how Rome unified Italy, the answer becomes clear. Rome didn't rely on one strength, it relied on all of them. It was a combination of military force and political flexibility, cultural integration, and a unique capacity for absorbing shocks. That's what made Rome different. That's what turned a city of huts on a cluster of hills into a state that would dominate the ancient world for centuries. And if you ever play a strategy game where everything suddenly falls into place because one alliance, one reform, or one settlement tips the balance, that feeling is the closest thing you'll get to understanding how Rome actually did it. All of these methods, conquest, colonization, alliance building, legal expansion, cultural blending, and the constant reinforcement of Roman identity form the framework for what would eventually become the Roman Empire. But Italy was where it all began. Italy was the testing ground. Italy was where the Roman system proved it could work. And once that was established, the rest of history, as they say, was inevitable.